And so to recap for this week, we have reached the end of week 7 for Understanding Contemporary Art, in which we have looked at the phenomenon of land art, which is something that is largely, though not exclusively, an American invention, especially an invention of the American Southwest, where all the great works of land art essentially have taken place, with the exception of the British land art. There's also some land art in Australia as well. But in America, it finds its most charismatic expression as something that began in the 1960s, essentially with Michael Heiser, his double negative in 1969-70, and his 9 shallow depressions in the Nevada desert in 67-68, and Walter de Maria's Earth Room at about the same time. So we looked at those works, and we looked at how the works of Michael Heiser, essentially with his charismatic city that remains still unfinished as an ongoing work and one of the biggest land art projects of all time, is as though with Michael Heiser he were digging down into the earth, and especially with city, we're allowing this a priori transcendental city structure to simply surface into view, as though we were archaeologists discovering it. That is part of the intended effect, I think, that he wants to convey with this transcendental a priori city. We looked at Robert Smithson and his spiral jetty, and we also looked at Walter de Maria's lightning field. All of these works take place in the Southwest, which has lots of space and tends to encourage colossalism and giganticism in artwork. And so that's where land art tends to be the place that flourishes the most. Then we moved on to look at the works of James Turrell, and essentially, though James Turrell is not primarily a land artist, since he is creating the biggest land artwork of all time with Roden Crater, then we have to look at him within the lens and the context of land art. Although most of his art has been an examination of the optical properties of light, and light has been his primary medium that he has used he's been sculpting in all of his life, starting with the cross-corner projections and the shallow space constructions, and especially his most charismatic sky spaces, in which he carves out holes in the ceiling, as though we were digging into the heavens, the way Michael Heiser digs down into the earth. Turrell sort of digs into the heavens, using a priori Platonic forms as his tools and instruments with which to do so. He's always organizing light into Platonic, pure transcendental Platonic forms, and he's always looking for these eternal forms in light, squares, circles, rectangles, and so forth. Then we moved on to look at Roden Crater, and we've seen that with Roden Crater, we find James Turrell near Flagstaff, Arizona, constructing land art's biggest work to date, re-territorializing this cinder cone volcano and transforming it, using the motif of the eye of God to look back to the heavens, to bring the earth down. And he's essentially building this work with this is a work that's built out of stone to last for centuries. And it is built with the same kinds of monumental attitude that the Egyptians had in constructing their works. You know, a pharaoh would spend his entire lifetime, or at least the time of his reign, constructing his pyramid as his burial place, and it would take decade after decade for them to do this, just as it has taken Turrell 40 years, and he's still nowhere near completion, really, on Roden Crater. But it's built out of stone, and it's built with the kind of metaphysics of transcendentalism. Turrell's ontology is definitely a metaphysical ontology of the quest for eternal forms found in the sky, and the sky is traditionally the place where the Platonic eternal forms reside, originally in as astrological figures and zodiacal forms, later with Plato's sort of mathematical forms and ethical ideas. But with Turrell, we have a modern metaphysician in the epoch of contemporary art looking to find these a priori transcendental forms within the heavens. Then we contrasted him with Andy Goldsworthy as a Scottish land artist who miniaturizes land art, and this may have something to do with the compressive environment of Great Britain, which is smaller. It doesn't have the expansiveness of the southwestern United States, which tends to encourage, which is an expansive environment and encourages expansiveness. But in Britain, the compressive nature of the environment may have encouraged Goldsworthy to miniaturize land art, to scale it down in an almost Japanese Zen-like fashion. And we found that his ontology was an ontology exactly opposed, polar opposites to James Turrell, of ephemerality, of vanishing. His forms are incredibly ephemeral. They vanish quickly. His structures are built to last for hours, sometimes days, depending on the work. And they're not a priori forms. They're forms that are found in nature, as though he were cracking nature open to unleash what would otherwise be it's form-building forces that it would use to construct these forms anyway. And so it's as though he's pulling the entelechies out of nature and simply making them visible for us, unleashing them from their snakeskins, as it were, so that we can see them, behold, right before us. And so that gives us a sense of the evolution of the week. We have looked at land art now, which is uncomfortable with museums. For the most part, it's not an art that sits very comfortably in installations and exhibitions in museums. It's an art that has left the museum behind, and that is out on the earth, that has left the city behind for the most part. Most of these land artists have, Andy Goldsworthy lives in a small village in Scotland, Penpont, where he was raised most of his life. It's a post-urban art, and the artists of the Southwest too, for the most part. James Turrell tends to live near Roden Crater, and Michael Heiser lives in a house near City, where he's been building that. They tend to be exiles from the city. The city does not need this art, and these artists do not need the city. They have gone back to nature, out in quest of a search for transcendental forms and new signifieds. And so for a final assignment for this week, it might be worth taking a work by any of these land artists that we have looked at. You could take one from Andy Goldsworthy, or you could take one from Michael Heiser or Robert Smithson, and compare and contrast them to see what their differences might be and what their ontological implications of the artist's visions might be, just as a way of rubbing them up against each other in the manner in which I have rubbed James Turrell up against Andy Goldsworthy to create the sparks of this sort of transcendentalist, eternalist cosmology versus this cosmology of time becoming an ephemerality. And so we'll leave it there for week 7.